Good evening, and welcome back to Plane Crash for Sleep. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable wherever you are. Let the world's noise fade away, and join me as we travel back to a summer evening in 1983, to the vast emptiness of northern Ontario, where a brand new Boeing 767 would transform into the world's largest and heaviest glider, and where two pilots would accomplish what many believed impossible. Tonight we're telling a different kind of story, one where everything goes catastrophically wrong, yet everyone survives. This is the tale of Air Canada Flight 143, forever known as the Gimli glider, a flight that ran completely out of fuel at 41,000 feet, and somehow, through a remarkable combination of skill, experience, knowledge, and sheer determination, managed to land safely at an abandoned Air Force base that had been converted into a racetrack. It's a story about the transition from one measurement system to another, about how new technology can create unexpected vulnerabilities, about organizational failures and individual heroism. But before we reach that extraordinary moment, when a powerless jetliner touches down on a runway full of surprised race car enthusiasts, we need to understand how a sophisticated modern aircraft, operated by a professional airline, could possibly take off with less than half the fuel it needed to reach its destination. The summer of 1983 found the commercial aviation industry in the midst of a technological revolution. The Boeing 767, introduced to airline service just the year before, represented the cutting edge of aircraft design. This was Boeing's first wide-body twin-engine jetliner, a medium-capacity aircraft designed to replace aging 707s and Douglas DC-8s on domestic and international routes. What made the 767 revolutionary wasn't just its fuel-efficient turbofan engines or its spacious two-aisle cabin, but its cockpit. For the first time in a wide-body aircraft, Boeing had designed the 767 to be flown by just two pilots. Gone was the flight engineer, that third crew member who had traditionally managed the aircraft's complex systems. In the 767, computers and automated systems handled what the flight engineer used to do, monitoring engines, managing fuel, controlling electrical and hydraulic systems. This two-pilot cockpit represented the future of airline operations, more efficient, less labor-intensive, and, in theory, just as safe as the traditional three-person crew. But the transition to this new philosophy created gaps in procedures and responsibilities, gaps that would prove critical on the evening of July 23rd. Air Canada had been among the launch customers for the 767, ordering 10 of the type to modernize its fleet. These were 767-200 variants, powered by Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines, capable of carrying up to 255 passengers across distances up to 7,000 kilometers. The airline took delivery of its first 767 in October 1982, and by July 1983, 4 of these brand-new aircraft were in service. The 7th aircraft in Air Canada's 767 order, registration Charlie Golf Alpha Uniform November, arrived at the airline on March 30, 1983. At just 4 months old in late July, this aircraft was essentially brand new, gleaming in Air Canada's livery, equipped with the latest technology. Everything you'd expect from a state-of-the-art jetliner. Yet this brand-new aircraft harbored a persistent problem that would set the stage for the events to come. The Fuel Quantity Information System, or FQIS, had been malfunctioning intermittently since delivery. This system, a sophisticated electronic assembly, monitored fuel levels in the aircraft's 3 tanks and displayed the information on gauges in the cockpit. The FQIS worked through 2 redundant channels, either one sufficient to operate the system. If both channels failed, the fuel gauges would go blank, leaving pilots without direct indication of how much fuel they carried. The FQIS failures were not unique to this particular aircraft. The system had proven troublesome across the early 767 fleet, with multiple carriers reporting similar problems. Replacement units were in short supply, and airlines sometimes had to wait days or weeks for serviceable components. Air Canada's maintenance procedures allowed dispatch of an aircraft with an inoperative FQIS under specific conditions outlined in the Minimum Equipment List, or MEL. The MEL is a document that specifies which equipment can be inoperative and under what restrictions the aircraft can still legally fly. For an inoperative FQIS, the MEL required that fuel quantity be verified by an alternate method, specifically by physically measuring the fuel in the tanks using dripsticks, long calibrated rods inserted into the tanks through access ports under the wings. The dripstick measurement, when properly converted to fuel weight, would provide the information the electronic gauges couldn't. This was the theory, at least. In practice, the procedures for handling FQIS failures had not been clearly defined, and the transition to the two-pilot cockpit meant that responsibilities once clearly held by the flight engineer now fell into a gray area between pilots and maintenance personnel. Adding another layer of complexity to this situation was Canada's ongoing transition from imperial to metric measurements. Canada had begun converting to the metric system in 1970, a process called metrication that would take 15 years to complete across various sectors. The aviation industry, with its expensive, long-lived equipment and strong ties to American standards, had been slow to adopt metric. Most of Air Canada's fleet used imperial measurements, with fuel quantities calculated in pounds and displayed in gallons or pounds on cockpit gauges. But when Air Canada ordered its 767s, the Canadian government, which owned the airline at the time, insisted that these new aircraft use metric measurements wherever international standards called for them. This meant the 767 fuel gauges displayed fuel weight in kilograms rather than pounds, and the dripsticks were calibrated in centimeters and liters rather than inches and gallons. This created a mixed fleet, where most aircraft used imperial measurements, but the newest, most sophisticated aircraft used metric. For pilots and ground crew who had spent their careers working in pounds and gallons, this transition introduced opportunities for confusion and error. On Friday, July 22, 1983, Charlie Golf Alpha Uniform November, which we'll call Charlie Golf for simplicity, underwent routine checks in Edmonton. A technician discovered that the FQIS was malfunctioning, with one of its two channels inoperative. Following standard procedure, he disabled the defective channel and made an entry in the aircraft logbook documenting the problem. This meant the aircraft could still operate with the working channel providing fuel indication, though it no longer had the redundancy of two channels. The next morning, Captain John Weir and co-pilot Captain Donald Johnson were assigned to fly Charlie Golf from Edmonton to Montreal via Ottawa. They were informed about the FQIS problem during their pre-flight briefing. Since the system was now operating on a single channel, they conducted a dripstick measurement to verify the fuel quantity, comparing it against what the working FQIS channel showed. The measurement matched the gauge reading, confirming that the remaining channel was providing accurate information. The flight to Montreal proceeded without incident, with the single FQIS channel continuing to work properly throughout. At Montreal's Dorval Airport, Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal arrived to take over Charlie Golf for Flight 143 to Edmonton, with an intermediate stop in Ottawa. Captain Pearson, 48 years old, was a highly experienced pilot with more than 15,000 flight hours total, and about 150 hours in the 767. Before joining Air Canada, he had flown executive aircraft, and in his personal time, he was an accomplished glider pilot, co-owning a Blahnik L-13 sailplane that he flew regularly. This glider experience, pursued as a hobby to maintain connection with pure stick-and-rudder flying, would prove invaluable in ways he could never have anticipated. First Officer Quintal, 36 years old, brought 7,000 hours of total flying experience, including time in the Royal Canadian Air Force, where he had been stationed at various bases, including Gimli, Manitoba. This local knowledge of a remote airfield would become crucial before the day ended. During the handover from Captain Weir, Pearson learned about the FQIS problem and the fact that the aircraft was operating with only one working channel. As the new crew conducted their pre-flight checks, an avionics technician arrived in the cockpit to address the FQIS issue. While waiting for the fuel truck to arrive, he re-enabled the defective channel and performed a self-test, hoping perhaps that the problem had resolved itself. The test failed, confirming the channel was still inoperative. But in the distraction of the fuel truck's arrival, the technician left the defective channel enabled when he departed. This seemingly minor oversight would have significant consequences. When Captain Pearson entered the cockpit and looked at the fuel gauges, he found them completely blank. Both FQIS channels were now offline, one because it was genuinely defective, and the other because enabling the defective channel had somehow disabled the working one. This meant the aircraft would have to be dispatched under MEL provisions for a completely inoperative FQIS, requiring dripstick measurements to determine fuel quantity. Under these circumstances, many captains might have refused the aircraft, declaring it unairworthy and waiting for the FQIS to be properly repaired. But Captain Pearson made a decision that would later be questioned extensively. He decided to accept the aircraft and proceed with the flight, relying on dripstick measurements as the MEL allowed. Pearson determined that he would take on enough fuel to fly directly from Montreal to Edmonton without the planned stop in Ottawa, where maintenance personnel were waiting with a borrowed FQIS processor to repair the system. His thinking was straightforward. If he stopped in Ottawa, the aircraft would be on the ground while maintenance worked on the FQIS, delaying the schedule. If he took on enough fuel to fly direct, he could get to Edmonton faster, and the FQIS could be fixed there. This was a commercial decision driven by schedule pressures, but it meant calculating a fuel load for the longer direct flight using only dripstick measurements, with no electronic backup to verify the quantity. The fuel calculation process should have been straightforward. The flight plan indicated that 22,300 kilograms of fuel would be required for the flight from Montreal to Edmonton. A dripstick measurement showed that 7,682 liters of fuel already remained in the tanks from the previous flights. To determine how much additional fuel needed to be added, someone needed to convert the 7,682 liters to kilograms, subtract that from the total required 22,300 kilograms, and then convert the result back to liters so the fueler would know how many liters to pump into the tanks. The conversion between liters and kilograms requires knowing the specific gravity or density of the fuel, a number that varies slightly depending on fuel temperature, but averages around 0.803 kilograms per liter for jet fuel. The correct calculation would have been 7,682 liters times 0.803 kilograms per liter equals 6,169 kilograms currently in tanks. 22,300 kilograms total required, minus 6,169 kilograms currently in tanks, equals 16,131 kilograms of additional fuel needed. 16,131 kilograms divided by 0.803 kilograms per liter equals 20,088 liters to be added. If this calculation had been performed correctly, Charlie Golf would have departed Montreal with sufficient fuel to reach Edmonton with reserves. But the calculation was not performed correctly. The confusion began with the density figure. The fueler's paperwork showed a density of 1.77, which was the density of jet fuel in pounds per liter, the conversion factor that had been used for Air Canada's Imperial calibrated fleet for years. This was the number everyone was familiar with, because it had been used on every other aircraft in the fleet. The 767, being metric, required the density in kilograms per liter, 0.803. But the people performing the calculation used the familiar 1.77 without recognizing that this was the wrong unit for a metric aircraft. The calculation they performed was 7,682 liters times 1.77 equals 13,597 pounds, which they treated as if it were kilograms. 22,300 kilograms required minus 13,597 kilograms equals 8,703 kilograms needed. 8,703 divided by 1.77 equals 4,916 liters to add. This calculation, using the wrong density factor and mixing units in a way that produced nonsensical results, indicated that less than 5,000 liters of fuel needed to be added, when in fact, over 20,000 liters were required. The fuel truck pumped in 4,916 liters, bringing the total fuel load to 12,598 liters, or approximately 10,100 kilograms. The aircraft needed 22,300 kilograms. It departed with less than half that amount. What makes this error particularly tragic is that multiple people checked the calculation, and nobody caught the mistake. The fueler performed the math, Captain Pearson verified it, First Officer Quintal reviewed it, and everyone agreed the numbers were correct. When Pearson entered 22,300 into the flight management computer, which was programmed to work in kilograms, it indicated sufficient fuel because it thought there were 22,300 kilograms in the tanks, when in fact there were barely 10,000. The entire chain of verification, designed to catch exactly this kind of error, failed completely. Investigation would later reveal multiple reasons for this failure. Nobody involved had been properly trained in performing fuel calculations with metric units. The responsibility for these calculations had historically rested with flight engineers, but with the 767's two-pilot cockpit, it wasn't clear who owned this task. The transition to metric was incomplete, with most personnel still thinking in imperial units and unfamiliar with the conversion factors needed for metric calculations. The FQIS failure removed the electronic cross-check that would normally verify fuel quantity. And perhaps most critically, confirmation bias led everyone to accept a plausible-sounding result without questioning whether the calculation method itself was correct. When multiple people independently verify the same incorrect calculation, the error becomes institutionalized, accepted as fact because everyone agrees, even though everyone is wrong. At 3:07 p.m. local time on July 23rd, Flight 143 pushed back from the gate at Montreal's Dorval Airport. On board were 61 passengers and 8 crew members, including the 2 pilots, a flight engineer observer in the cockpit jump seat who was catching a ride to Winnipeg, and 5 flight attendants in the cabin. The passengers represented typical domestic travel, business people heading west, families going on vacation, individuals visiting relatives, the usual mix of purposes that fill regional flights. They settled into their seats, expecting a routine flight across Canada, a few hours of reading or conversation, or watching the landscape slide past below. Then arrival in Edmonton or Ottawa, depending on their destination. None of them knew. None of them could possibly have known that the aircraft carrying them held only enough fuel to get halfway to Edmonton before the engines would starve and stop. That their routine afternoon flight would become one of aviation's most extraordinary emergencies. The initial portion of the flight proceeded normally. Charlie Golf climbed away from Montreal, turning northwest to follow the route across Quebec and Ontario toward the Canadian prairies beyond. The weather was excellent, clear skies and good visibility, the kind of summer evening that makes flying a pure pleasure. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal settled into the routine rhythm of managing the aircraft, monitoring systems, communicating with air traffic control, handling the small tasks that occupy pilots during cruise flight. The passengers in the cabin received their beverages and snacks, the flight attendants moving through the aisles with their carts, the whole familiar ritual of airline service. The aircraft was performing flawlessly, both engines running smoothly at cruise power, all systems showing normal. On the blank fuel gauges that should have been displaying decreasing fuel quantity, there was nothing, just empty displays that gave no indication of the crisis that was building in the fuel tanks beneath the wings. The aircraft was consuming fuel at its normal rate, roughly 7,000 kilograms per hour, combined between both engines. The tanks held barely 10,000 kilograms total. The mathematics were inexorable. In less than 90 minutes, the tanks would be dry. At approximately 8:07 p.m. Central Daylight Time, as Flight 143 cruised at 41,000 feet over Red Lake, Ontario, the cockpit warning system sounded with a beep, indicating a fuel pressure problem on the left side. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal looked at the warning, processing what it might mean. The obvious interpretation was that the left fuel pump had failed, an unusual occurrence, but not a critical emergency. The Boeing 767's fuel system was designed to allow gravity feed if the pumps failed, meaning fuel could flow to the engines through gravity alone, as long as aircraft remained in relatively level flight. They silenced the alarm, knowing they could continue safely to Winnipeg, the nearest suitable airport, and land on what they assumed was adequate fuel, with one pump inoperative and the other working normally. But just a few seconds later, another beep sounded, this time indicating a fuel pressure problem on the right side as well. Both fuel pumps indicating failure simultaneously was extraordinary, suggesting not individual pump failures, but something more systemic. Yet even this didn't immediately reveal the truth to the crew. The possibility that the aircraft was simply out of fuel, that sophisticated modern jetliner had exhausted its fuel supply in flight, seemed too improbable to consider seriously. But that's exactly what was happening. The left engine, having consumed all available fuel from its supply, began to wind down, its turbine slowing as thrust decreased, the engine indicator showing declining parameters as the engine transitioned from producing power to becoming an aerodynamic brake. Captain Pearson immediately declared an emergency and requested priority handling to Winnipeg. The left engine failure light illuminated, confirming what the instrument showed. First Officer Quintal began running through the engine failure checklist, attempting to restart the left engine, while Pearson flew the aircraft toward Winnipeg. For a Boeing 767, flying on one engine was well within design parameters, a situation covered extensively in training. The aircraft would lose some performance and altitude capability, but a single-engine landing was routine enough that pilots practiced it regularly in simulators. The crew coordinated with Winnipeg Air Traffic Control, communicating their situation and intentions, receiving vectors toward the airport, and clearances to descend. This was a manageable emergency, serious but within the bounds of what airline pilots train for and can handle. Then the unthinkable happened. At approximately 8:09 p.m., as the crew worked through their emergency procedures, the cockpit warning system sounded, with a completely different alarm, a sharp bong that neither pilot had ever heard before in actual operations. Both Pearson and Quintal froze momentarily, processing this unfamiliar sound, searching their memories for what it might indicate. This was the all engines out warning, an alarm so rarely heard that even experienced pilots might go their entire careers without encountering it. Before they could fully process the implications, the right engine began winding down, its fuel supply exhausted, thrust decreasing, the aircraft suddenly powerless. In that moment, the reality of their situation became brutally clear. Flight 143 was 41,000 feet above the remote wilderness of northern Ontario, with both engines stopped. No power, no thrust. Nothing but altitude and airspeed between the aircraft and the ground far below. The loss of engine power had cascading effects beyond the obvious loss of thrust. The engines on a modern jetliner provide more than propulsion. They drive electrical generators that power the aircraft's systems. They drive hydraulic pumps that operate flight controls. They provide bleed air for pressurization and air conditioning. When both engines stop, most of these systems fail. The cockpit instruments began going dark as electrical systems lost power. The flight controls, normally hydraulically powered, became much harder to move. The aircraft was transforming from a sophisticated fly-by-wire machine into something more fundamental, an aerodynamic shape gliding through air, its fate now determined by physics and pilot skill rather than engine power and computer automation. The Boeing 767 is designed with redundancy for this unthinkable scenario. A ram air turbine, a small propeller-driven generator, automatically deployed from the belly of the aircraft, extending into the airstream where the wind drove it like a small windmill. This ram air turbine provided enough electrical and hydraulic power to keep essential systems operating: basic flight controls, key instruments, critical safety equipment. But the power available was minimal compared to normal operations. The pilots would have only partial control authority, limited instrument information, and no margin for error. Captain Pearson took full control of the aircraft, his years of experience and his glider flying background suddenly becoming the most critical assets on board. He needed to establish the aircraft in its best glide configuration, the speed and attitude that would maximize distance covered for each foot of altitude lost. In a glider, pilots develop an instinctive understanding of glide performance. They know exactly what speed gives maximum range. They can judge whether they can reach a particular landing site by comparing altitude to distance. But Pearson had never glided a Boeing 767. Nobody had, because the scenario was considered so improbable that it wasn't included in training programs. The aircraft's flight manual contained no information on optimum glide speed for a powerless 767, no data on rate of descent, no guidance on glide ratio. Pearson had to estimate, using his glider experience and his knowledge of the 767's performance with engines at idle. He knew that with engines idling, the aircraft descended at about 1,500 feet per minute. With engines completely stopped and windmilling, creating additional drag, the descent rate would be higher. He estimated the best glide speed at approximately 220 knots, a judgment based on feel and experience rather than any documented performance data. He established the aircraft at this speed, trading some of their precious altitude to maintain airspeed, finding the balance point where the aircraft glided most efficiently through the air. First Officer Quintal, meanwhile, was calculating whether they could reach Winnipeg. Using altitude information from the standby instruments and distance information from air traffic control, he began working out the numbers. At 41,000 feet, descending at an estimated 2,000 feet per minute, they had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining. The distance to Winnipeg was approximately 65 nautical miles. Quintal did the mathematics and delivered devastating news to Pearson. They couldn't make Winnipeg. The airport was too far. The aircraft was descending too fast. They would hit the ground several miles short of the runway. They needed an alternate, some closer airport or landing site they could reach before altitude ran out. In a glider, pilots always maintain awareness of potential landing fields, constantly evaluating where they could land if they couldn't maintain altitude. That mindset, that constant calculation of options, was now the only thing that could save Flight 143. First Officer Quintal, searching his memory of the area, recalled an airfield at Gimli, Manitoba. He had been stationed there years earlier when it was RCAF Station Gimli, a Royal Canadian Air Force training base with long runways suitable for military jets. The base had closed in the early 1970s and been converted to civilian use, but Quintal remembered the runway as long and well-maintained. The distance to Gimli was approximately 45 miles, about 20 miles closer than Winnipeg. Quintal ran the numbers again, comparing altitude, distance, and descent rate. It would be close, desperately close, but Gimli was reachable if everything went perfectly. Pearson accepted the recommendation immediately. They would aim for Gimli. Air traffic control in Winnipeg initially tried to guide the flight toward Winnipeg, not understanding that the crew situation was so desperate that even 20 additional miles was impossible. When Pearson and Quintal made clear they were diverting to Gimli and needed immediate vectors, the controllers adapted, providing heading information to guide the powerless aircraft toward the abandoned Air Force Base. The approach to Gimli would be entirely visual. The aircraft's navigation systems were operating on minimal power, providing limited information, and the pilots would need to fly by reference to the ground, finding the airfield visually and maneuvering to land. In the cabin, the flight attendants were dealing with their own crisis. The loss of engine power had been accompanied by the loss of normal electrical power, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness, illuminated only by emergency lighting. The pressurization system had failed, causing the cabin altitude to begin increasing, though the aircraft's descent kept this manageable. The passengers, who had been calmly enjoying their flight just minutes earlier, now found themselves in an airplane that had gone silent and dark, descending rapidly. No engine noise, no normal sounds, just the rush of air over the fuselage, and the occasional announcements from the flight attendants trying to keep everyone calm. The attendants prepared the cabin for an emergency landing, demonstrating brace positions, checking seatbelts, moving passengers seated near overwing exits to other seats so that able-bodied passengers could operate the exits if needed. The passengers, to their enormous credit, remained remarkably calm. There was fear, certainly, anxiety and worry, and the racing thoughts that come when you realize your aircraft has lost its engines, and nobody can tell you for certain that you'll survive the next 20 minutes. But there was no panic, no hysteria, just quiet determination to follow instructions and hope that the pilots could perform a miracle. In the cockpit, Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal were completely focused on the task of reaching Gimli. They had descended through 35,000 feet, still had enough altitude that the runway should be reachable, but the margin was paper thin. Every foot of altitude was precious. Any turn that wasn't absolutely necessary wasted energy they couldn't afford to lose. Pearson kept the aircraft in a gentle descent, maintaining his estimated best glide speed, making only the corrections necessary to stay on course for Gimli. As they descended below 20,000 feet, First Officer Quintal spotted the airfield ahead, a thin ribbon of concrete, visible against the darkening landscape. The sight of the runway, confirmation that their destination actually existed and was where they thought it would be, brought a moment of relief. But relief turned to concern as they got closer and higher detail became visible. The aircraft was approaching from the north, meaning they would be landing on runway 32 left, the northern runway of Gimli's two parallel runways. But Quintal could see something wrong. There were vehicles on the runway, people, activity that shouldn't have been there if this was an active airfield. What he didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Gimli had been transformed into a motorsports park. The southern runway remained in use for light aircraft, but the northern runway had been converted to a drag strip for auto racing. July 23rd was Family Day for the Winnipeg Sports Car Club, and the runway was filled with racing cars, spectators, temporary barriers, and all the infrastructure of a race meet. Hundreds of people were gathered on what had been a military runway, completely unaware that a powerless Boeing 767 was descending toward them from 40,000 feet above. Pearson and Quintal now faced a new problem. They were approaching too high and too fast. Under normal circumstances, pilots would extend flaps and slats to increase drag and reduce stall speed, allowing a steeper approach and slower landing speed. But the hydraulic power available from the ram air turbine was insufficient to extend the high-lift devices. The flaps and slats remained retracted, meaning the aircraft would land much faster than normal, requiring more runway to stop, and the approach would be flatter, making it harder to lose altitude without adding power, which they didn't have. Pearson briefly considered attempting a 360-degree turn to lose altitude, but rejected the idea as too risky. The turn would bleed energy and might leave them short of the runway. He needed another way to lose altitude and speed while still maintaining control. This was where his glider experience became decisive. In gliders and light aircraft, pilots use a maneuver called a forward slip to lose altitude quickly without gaining speed. By applying rudder to point the nose sideways while using opposite aileron to prevent the aircraft from turning, the pilot presents the entire side of the fuselage to the oncoming air, creating massive drag that steepens the descent angle dramatically. This technique is common in gliders, occasionally used in light aircraft during emergencies, but practically never executed in large transport jets. The maneuver requires precise control and judgment, holding the aircraft in a cross-controlled condition that would normally be considered dangerous, all while descending rapidly toward the ground. Pearson decided to perform a forward slip in a Boeing 767. He applied right rudder while simultaneously adding left aileron, yawing the aircraft's nose to the right while preventing the wings from banking in that direction. The 767, that 300,000-pound machine designed to cruise smoothly at 40,000 feet, suddenly began flying sideways, its nose pointed well off its actual direction of travel. The entire side of the fuselage creating drag, the descent rate increasing dramatically. Witnesses on the ground, including teenage Art Zook, who was riding his bicycle down the drag strip, saw the massive airliner descending toward them, flying cockeyed, its nose pointing to the side, engines silent, the whole aircraft slip-sliding through the air in a configuration that looked impossible and wrong, but was actually the only thing that could work. Zook and his friends scrambled off the runway. The crowd scattered. Race cars were hurriedly driven clear as the Boeing descended through the final 100 feet. Captain Pearson held the slip until he was just feet above the runway, then straightened the aircraft out at the last possible moment, leveled the wings, pointed the nose straight ahead, and touched down approximately 800 feet from the threshold of runway 32 left. Landing gear made contact first, the tires screeching as they took the aircraft's weight at a higher than normal landing speed. But immediately there was a problem. The nose landing gear collapsed. The ram air turbine extension procedure had required opening a hatch in the area of the nose gear, and this had somehow prevented the nose gear from fully locking down. When the nose settled to the runway after landing, the gear folded backward, and the nose of the aircraft dropped to the concrete with a shower of sparks. The 767 slid down the runway on its nose, and the right main landing gear, grinding along the concrete at over 100 knots, creating a spectacular trail of sparks and smoke as metal abraded against pavement. The right main tires burst from the friction and heat, adding to the chaos, but the aircraft was decelerating, its massive momentum being absorbed by friction with the runway surface. The 767 slid 4,000 feet down the runway before coming to rest just 500 feet short of the gathered crowd at the end of the drag strip. The aircraft sat on the runway, its nose collapsed, right main gear tires blown, fuel vapors visible around it. But it was stopped. It was on the ground. The impossible landing had been accomplished. In the cabin, passengers and flight attendants were momentarily stunned by the violence of the landing and the grinding slide that followed. But everyone was alive. Everyone was conscious. The cabin structure had remained intact. The evacuation began immediately. Flight attendants opened exits and deployed evacuation slides, shouting instructions to passengers to get out quickly in case fire broke out. The passengers, incredible in their discipline, evacuated rapidly and orderly, sliding down the chutes and running away from the aircraft. Some sustained minor injuries during the evacuation, twisted ankles and bruises from the slides, but nothing serious, nothing that wouldn't heal. Within minutes, all 69 people aboard Flight 143 were standing on the Gimli drag strip, alive and safe, watching the aircraft that had brought them there, sitting crumpled but unburned on the runway. The race fans, initially shocked by the sudden appearance of a jetliner on their track, quickly transformed into an impromptu rescue crew, helping passengers away from the aircraft, offering water and assistance, calling emergency services, doing everything they could to help. The Gimli Volunteer Fire Department arrived with their small truck, and though they lacked the equipment to handle a major jet fire, they stood ready with handheld extinguishers, prepared to fight any flames that appeared. But no fire came. Without fuel to burn, the aircraft simply sat there, damaged but intact, a testament to the strength of its construction and the skill of the pilots who had brought it down safely. The aftermath of Flight 143 was complex and multi-layered. The immediate public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, celebrating Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal as heroes who had saved 69 lives through extraordinary skill and determination. The media coverage was intense and largely congratulatory, with the Gimli glider, as the aircraft was immediately nicknamed, becoming an international sensation. People who normally paid little attention to aviation found themselves fascinated by this story of a jetliner running out of fuel and gliding to safety. The drama of the emergency combined with the happy ending, creating a narrative that captured public imagination. But behind this public celebration, the investigation into how Flight 143 could have taken off without adequate fuel was revealing uncomfortable truths about Air Canada's procedures and the challenges of technological transition. The Board of Inquiry, led by Justice George Lockwood, conducted an exhaustive examination of the fuel calculation error and the organizational factors that had allowed it to occur. The investigation found fault at multiple levels. The immediate cause was the incorrect fuel calculation, using 1.77 pounds per liter instead of 0.803 kilograms per liter. But this error occurred within a context of systematic failures. Air Canada had not provided adequate training on metric calculations. The airline had not clearly assigned responsibility for fuel calculations in the two-pilot 767 cockpit, leaving an ambiguous gap where everyone assumed someone else owned the task. The MEL procedures for dispatching with an inoperative FQIS were inadequate and had not been properly communicated. The decision to operate the aircraft with completely blank fuel gauges, while technically legal under the MEL, represented poor judgment and commercial pressure overriding safety concerns. Justice Lockwood was careful to note that this was not simply a metric mix-up, that framing it as confusion between measurement systems missed the deeper issues. The people involved hadn't been confused about units. They had used the wrong conversion factor while believing they were using the correct one. A failure of procedure and training, rather than a failure to understand imperial versus metric. He noted that multiple safety layers had failed sequentially. First, the FQIS itself, then the requirement not to dispatch without working fuel gauges, then the verification of fuel quantity through proper calculation. Each layer failing independently, but all necessary for the accident to occur. This was classic Swiss cheese model accident causation, where multiple defenses must be breached simultaneously for disaster to result. In this case, the final layer, pilot skill and experience, prevented disaster by accomplishing something that nobody had thought possible: gliding a 767.65 miles to a safe landing on a runway that shouldn't even have been there. Air Canada initially responded to the investigation by suspending and demoting the pilots and maintenance personnel involved. Captain Pearson was demoted for 6 months, First Officer Quintal suspended for 2 weeks, and 3 ground crew members also suspended. This punitive response reflected the airline's need to demonstrate accountability and its initial instinct to blame individuals for what was fundamentally a systemic failure. But public opinion and the aviation community pushed back strongly against this approach. These pilots had saved 69 lives through extraordinary airmanship. Yes, they had participated in the fuel miscalculation, but they had done so within a system that had failed to provide adequate training and clear procedures. Their actions after realizing the emergency had been exemplary, demonstrating exactly the kind of skill and judgment that airlines should celebrate rather than punish. The pilots' union defended them vigorously, and eventually Air Canada reversed the disciplinary actions, recognizing that the broader systemic failures were more significant than individual errors. The investigation's final report made numerous recommendations aimed at preventing similar occurrences. Air Canada was directed to improve training on metric calculations and fuel management procedures. The airline was required to clarify responsibility for fuel verification in 2 pilot cockpits, ensuring that both pilots understood their role in the process and that ambiguity about task ownership was eliminated. Procedures for operating with inoperative fuel gauges were tightened, with stronger emphasis on when aircraft should not be dispatched and what verification steps were mandatory when dispatch was allowed. The report also highlighted the need for better communication between flight operations, maintenance, and flight crews, particularly during the transition to new aircraft types with different systems and procedures. Boeing was asked to review the 767's fuel system displays and consider whether additional safeguards could prevent operation with insufficient fuel. The aviation industry more broadly took note of the incident as a case study in how technological transitions can create unexpected vulnerabilities, particularly when new systems eliminate traditional crew positions without adequately redistributing their responsibilities. Charlie Golf Alpha Uniform November, the aircraft itself, was repaired and returned to service. The damage from the collapsed nose gear and the slide down the runway was substantial, but not beyond repair. Boeing technicians assessed the structure, finding that the airframe had withstood the emergency landing remarkably well, a testament to the 767's robust design. The nose structure was rebuilt, the collapsed landing gear replaced, damaged skin panels repaired or replaced, systems tested and verified. 5 months after its dramatic landing at Gimli, the aircraft returned to commercial service with Air Canada. It flew for the airline for another 25 years, accumulating thousands of additional flights, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. In 2008, Air Canada finally retired the aircraft from service, selling it to a Texas-based cargo operator. The Gimli glider, as it remained known throughout its service life, continued flying freight operations until 2014, when it was finally withdrawn from service and sent to an Arizona boneyard. There it sat, among hundreds of other retired aircraft, slowly being stripped of usable parts, eventually cut up for scrap. The physical evidence of one of aviation's most remarkable emergencies, gradually disappearing. But before the aircraft was destroyed, the nose section was preserved and donated to the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, where it remains on display as a memorial to the extraordinary events of July 23, 1983. The story of Flight 143 resonated deeply within the aviation community, for reasons beyond the drama of the emergency itself. The incident demonstrated that even the most sophisticated modern aircraft with the latest technology could find themselves in situations requiring basic stick and rudder flying skills. That automation and systems were wonderful until they failed. And when they failed, only pilot skill and judgment stood between survival and disaster. Captain Pearson's glider background, pursued as a hobby with no expectation it would ever be relevant to airline operations, proved to be exactly the experience needed to accomplish the impossible. His decision to perform a forward slip in a Boeing 767, a maneuver never contemplated in any manual or training program, showed the kind of creative problem-solving that distinguishes competent pilots from truly exceptional ones. First Officer Quintle's memory of Gimli's location, based on his military service years earlier, provided the destination that made survival possible. Without that knowledge, the crew would have continued toward Winnipeg and fallen short, attempting an emergency landing in wilderness or on a highway, with outcomes far less certain. The combination of Pearson's gliding experience and Quintle's local knowledge created a perfect synergy. Two pilots whose individual backgrounds complemented each other in ways that seemed almost providential. The incident also highlighted the importance of understanding not just how to operate systems when they work, but what happens when they fail. The Boeing 767's two-pilot cockpit eliminated the flight engineer position, distributing those responsibilities between the two remaining pilots and automated systems. This philosophy assumed that automation would handle routine system management reliably, freeing pilots to focus on flying the aircraft. But Flight 143 showed that when automation failed, pilots needed to understand the underlying systems well enough to manage them manually. The crew's initial confusion about the fuel warnings, their difficulty understanding what the multiple failures meant, reflected inadequate training on system degradation and failure modes. This realization prompted airlines and training programs to place greater emphasis on teaching what happens when things go wrong, ensuring pilots understood the cascading effects of system failures and could respond appropriately, even in situations they'd never encountered before. The concept of threat and error management, now fundamental to crew resource management training, was influenced partly by incidents like Flight 143 that revealed how multiple small errors could compound into critical situations, requiring exceptional skill to resolve. The public's fascination with the Gimli glider story extended well beyond the initial media coverage. Books were written about the incident, television documentaries produced, the story retold in various formats as an example of human ingenuity triumphing over technological failure. The incident appeared in aviation safety courses as a case study, with student pilots and airline trainees studying the sequence of events, discussing what they might have done differently, learning from both the mistakes that created the emergency and the extraordinary airmanship that resolved it. Captain Pearson became a sought-after speaker at aviation conferences and safety symposia, sharing his experience and insights with audiences who recognized that his story contained valuable lessons about skill, judgment, and the importance of maintaining basic flying abilities even in an age of increasing automation. He always emphasized that the successful outcome had required luck as well as skill, that the presence of a suitable runway within gliding range was fortunate, that the lack of fire after landing was lucky, that numerous small factors had aligned favorably. But his modesty couldn't obscure the fact that he had accomplished something truly remarkable, bringing a powerless, heavy jet down safely in conditions that would have defeated lesser pilots. First Officer Quintle's contribution was sometimes overshadowed by focus on Pearson's flying skills, but his role was equally crucial. His suggestion to divert to Gimli provided the destination that made survival possible. His assistance in managing the emergency, calculating distances and altitudes, helping prepare the cabin, allowed Pearson to focus entirely on flying the aircraft. The incident demonstrated the importance of effective crew resource management. Two pilots working together as a team, each contributing their unique knowledge and skills, communicating clearly, supporting each other through an extraordinary crisis. This teamwork aspect became another key lesson extracted from Flight 143, reinforcing the industry's growing emphasis on crew coordination and communication as fundamental safety skills. The flight attendants also deserved recognition for their handling of the cabin emergency. Faced with passengers in a darkened, unpressurized aircraft with no engine noise and no clear information about what was happening, they maintained calm, prepared the cabin for emergency landing, and conducted a rapid evacuation that got everyone out safely with only minor injuries. Their professionalism under extreme stress contributed significantly to the successful outcome. The technical investigation into why the FQIS had failed in the first place revealed issues with the early 767's fuel quantity system that extended beyond Charlie Golf. The system had proven troublesome across multiple carriers, with intermittent failures that were difficult to diagnose and repair. Boeing worked with operators to improve reliability, eventually redesigning components and updating software to address the recurring problems. By the mid-1980s, FQIS reliability had improved significantly, though the system's early troubles had already prompted changes in MEL procedures and dispatch requirements. The incident reinforced the principle that critical systems like fuel quantity measurement should have adequate redundancy, and that allowing operations with degraded systems required careful risk assessment and robust alternate procedures. The industry also learned about the challenges of introducing metric measurements in aviation. While metrication had clear benefits in international operations and scientific precision, the transition period created opportunities for confusion and error, particularly in mixed fleets, where some aircraft used imperial and others used metric. Airlines that completed their metrication programs developed better training and procedural safeguards to manage the transition, ensuring personnel understood conversion factors and had tools to verify calculations. For the passengers and crew of Flight 143, the experience left lasting impressions, though individual reactions varied widely. Some passengers developed fear of flying, the trauma of experiencing both engines failing, and the emergency landing, creating anxiety they struggled to overcome. Others felt grateful for their survival and developed deeper appreciation for the skills of airline pilots and the safety of modern aviation. Some formed connections with fellow passengers, sharing the bond of having survived an extraordinary experience together. The pilots continued their careers with Air Canada, both eventually retiring after long and successful service. Captain Pearson became something of a celebrity in aviation circles, his name forever associated with the Gimli glider incident. He continued flying gliders recreationally, maintaining the skills that had proven so valuable during the emergency. First Officer Quintal also continued with Air Canada, eventually upgrading to captain and flying various aircraft types until his retirement. Both men maintained that they had simply done their jobs, that their actions during the emergency were what any well-trained pilot would have attempted. Though the aviation community recognized that few pilots would have succeeded where they had. The broader lessons from Flight 143 influenced aviation safety practices for decades. The incident demonstrated the importance of maintaining diverse pilot skills, even as automation increased. Airlines began emphasizing hand-flying skills in training, ensuring pilots could control aircraft manually without relying on automated systems. The value of varied flying backgrounds, like Pearson's glider experience, was recognized as bringing perspectives and skills that pure airline training might not provide. Procedures for fuel management were strengthened industry-wide with multiple verification steps and clearer assignment of responsibilities. The recognition that system transitions create vulnerability periods led to more careful management of changes like metrication, ensuring adequate training and support during implementation. The incident also contributed to evolving understanding of human factors in aviation, particularly how confirmation bias can lead multiple people to accept incorrect calculations, and how organizational pressures can influence safety-critical decisions like whether to dispatch an aircraft with degraded systems. The meteorological conditions on the evening of July 23rd had been nearly perfect for the emergency landing. The excellent visibility allowed visual navigation and identification of the runway from distance. The calm winds meant crosswind corrections weren't necessary during the approach. The long summer daylight hours meant the landing occurred in good light rather than darkness. Had the emergency occurred at night, in poor weather, or in turbulent conditions, the outcome might have been very different. This element of luck was acknowledged in the investigation, a reminder that even the best skills and judgment sometimes require favorable circumstances to succeed. The incident reinforced the pilot's adage that it's better to be lucky than good, though ideally you want to be both. Captain Pearson had both luck and exceptional skill, and the combination saved 69 lives. The conversion of the Gimli runway to a drag strip, which seemed initially like a disaster waiting to happen when the aircraft appeared overhead, ultimately proved fortunate. The runway remained paved and in reasonable condition, despite no longer serving aircraft traffic. It was long enough to accommodate the 767's high-speed landing. The drag strip hadn't added obstacles or structures that would have made landing impossible. The crowd gathered at the far end of the runway had sufficient warning to clear the area. If the runway had been abandoned and deteriorated, or if it had been redeveloped for purposes incompatible with aircraft operations, the landing might not have been possible. The fact that it remained usable, even in its new role as a motorsports facility, provided the final piece of luck that allowed the successful outcome. The Winnipeg Sports Car Club members who were present that day witnessed something utterly unexpected and extraordinary. A massive jetliner appearing from nowhere and sliding down their drag strip in a shower of sparks. Several captured photographs and video footage that became historical records of the incident. Their rapid clearing of the runway and subsequent assistance to evacuating passengers contributed to the successful outcome. The investigation's examination of the fuel calculation error revealed how easily sophisticated people can make fundamental mistakes when working under pressure with unfamiliar procedures. Everyone involved in the fuel miscalculation was competent and experienced. Nobody was careless or incompetent. Yet they all accepted a calculation that was profoundly wrong. This highlighted the importance of independent verification methods, cross-checks that don't rely on performing the same calculation the same way, tools or procedures that can catch errors, even when multiple people agree. Modern fuel management systems include multiple independent methods of verifying fuel quantity, making it much harder for calculation errors to go undetected. The aircraft's fuel quantity computer cross-checks against sensors. Ground fueling systems verify quantity independently. and multiple people using different methods must all agree before fuel loading is considered correct. These redundancies, implemented partly in response to lessons from Flight 143 and other fuel-related incidents, have made fuel miscalculations extraordinarily rare in modern operations. The incident also raised questions about how aircraft should be designed to handle total electrical failure. The ram air turbine that deployed when both engines failed provided enough power to control the aircraft and attempt a landing, but just barely. The limitations on available power meant that high-lift devices couldn't be extended, making the landing faster and more dangerous than it would have been with flaps available. Boeing's design philosophy had considered dual-engine failure so improbable that minimal provision was made for it. The successful outcome of Flight 143, achieved despite these limitations, validated the basic approach while highlighting that more robust emergency power systems might improve survivability in the unthinkable scenario. Subsequent aircraft designs incorporated lessons learned, ensuring that emergency power systems could support more functionality, including some high-lift device operation. Though the basic philosophy remained that dual-engine failure was extraordinarily unlikely, and complete protection against every possible scenario impossible. The story of the Gimli glider became part of Canadian cultural heritage, a uniquely Canadian tale of competence, resourcefulness, and calm professionalism in the face of disaster. The incident occurred during a period when Canadian aviation was establishing itself on the world stage, with Air Canada and other carriers expanding international routes and Canadian pilots earning reputations for skill and professionalism. Flight 143 reinforced this reputation, demonstrating that Canadian pilots could handle the most extreme emergencies with skill and grace. The fact that the incident occurred in a small Manitoba town, that local volunteers and race fans provided assistance, that the whole event had a distinctly Canadian flavor of understated heroism and community cooperation, made it resonate particularly strongly in Canada. The aircraft nose section on display at the Canada Aviation Museum serves as a physical reminder of the incident, allowing visitors to see the actual structure that survived the extraordinary emergency landing. For aviation historians and safety analysts, Flight 143 represents a fascinating case study in how multiple factors must align for catastrophic situations to occur, and how equally precise alignment of favorable factors can enable survival. The fuel miscalculation required confusion about measurement systems, inadequate training, failure of multiple cross-checks, and organizational pressures to dispatch the aircraft. The successful outcome required Pearson's glider experience, Quintal's knowledge of Gimli, the proximity of the runway to the failure point, the excellent weather, the fact that the runway remained usable, the ram air turbine providing enough power to maintain control, and countless other small factors that made the impossible possible. If any single element had been different, the outcome might have been tragedy rather than triumph. This sensitivity to initial conditions, the way small changes cascade into profoundly different results, exemplifies complexity theory in action, showing how aviation operations exist in a space where disaster and survival are separated by margins that seem terrifyingly small, yet are managed successfully thousands of times daily, through careful attention to procedures and continuous learning from close calls. The incident's timing, occurring in 1983, placed it near the beginning of the aviation industry's modern safety era. The previous decade had seen numerous high-profile accidents, prompting development of crew resource management, ground proximity warning systems, and enhanced focus on human factors in accident causation. Flight 143 contributed to this evolution, providing another data point demonstrating that accidents typically result from multiple contributing factors, rather than single catastrophic failures. The investigation's emphasis on systemic issues, rather than individual blame, reflected the growing understanding that punishing individuals rarely improves safety, while fixing systemic problems prevents recurrence. This philosophy, now fundamental to modern accident investigation, was still relatively new in the early 1980s, and investigations like the one into Flight 143 helped establish it as best practice. The successful outcome of Flight 143 also provided valuable data on aircraft structural capability during extreme operations. The 767's airframe withstood a landing significantly faster than designed landing speed, followed by a violent slide on collapsed gear, and remained structurally intact. No passengers or crew were killed or seriously injured, despite the violence of the landing and the evacuation down emergency slides. This demonstrated that aircraft structure, when properly designed and maintained, provides substantial protection, even in scenarios beyond normal operational limits. Boeing used data from the incident to validate and refine structural analysis methods, improving understanding of how aircraft perform in extreme conditions. The incident also validated design choices like the ram air turbine and emergency backup systems, showing that these rarely used features could function effectively in actual emergencies, rather than just theoretical scenarios. For the town of Gimli, the incident brought unexpected fame. The tiny Manitoba community, population around 2,000, suddenly found itself known internationally as the site of the Gimli glider landing. The town embraced this identity, establishing commemorative displays and incorporating the incident into local history. The runway where the landing occurred remains visible, still used occasionally by light aircraft, though no longer serving as a drag strip. Visitors sometimes come to Gimli specifically to see where the famous landing took place, walking the runway, imagining the massive Boeing 767 sliding toward them in a shower of sparks. For residents who witnessed the landing, the memory remains vivid decades later. One of those extraordinary moments when history arrives unexpectedly in your quiet town on a summer evening. Some of the race fans and local residents who assisted with the evacuation maintained connections with the crew and passengers over the years, bound together by having shared an extraordinary experience. The media coverage of Flight 143, while generally positive, also included criticism of Air Canada's maintenance practices and safety culture. The airline faced uncomfortable questions about how such a fundamental error could occur, whether cost-cutting had compromised safety, whether the rush to introduce new aircraft had outpaced adequate training and procedure development. Air Canada responded by implementing the investigation's recommendations, strengthening fuel management procedures, improving training programs, and clarifying responsibilities in two pilot cockpits. The airline also conducted an internal review of its safety culture, examining whether organizational pressures were influencing safety-critical decisions inappropriately. This self-examination, prompted by the incident and the public scrutiny that followed, contributed to improvements that enhanced safety across the airline's operations. The willingness to acknowledge systemic problems and commit to fixing them, rather than simply blaming individuals and moving on, reflected mature organizational thinking about safety. The incident had implications for pilot training that extended well beyond Air Canada. Airlines and training organizations worldwide examined their programs to ensure pilots maintained fundamental flying skills even as automation increased. The value of diverse flying backgrounds, like Pearson's glider experience, prompted some discussion about whether airlines should encourage or even require pilots to maintain proficiency in non-airline flying, though this never became formalized policy. The recognition that unusual emergencies might require creative problem-solving and application of skills from unexpected sources led to training scenarios that pushed pilots beyond standard emergency procedures, encouraging them to think flexibly about solutions. The emphasis on understanding aircraft systems deeply enough to manage them when automation failed became a key component of modern training programs, with pilots learning not just which buttons to push, but why systems work the way they do, and what happens when they don't work. The question of whether Captain Pearson should have accepted the aircraft for departure with completely blank fuel gauges remained contentious. Technically, the MEL allowed dispatch under those conditions with dripstick verification, so his decision was legal. But many in the aviation community argued that blank fuel gauges in a brand new aircraft should have triggered the judgment call to refuse the aircraft regardless of MEL provisions. This tension between regulatory compliance and captain's authority, between following procedures and exercising judgment to exceed minimum requirements, highlighted an ongoing debate in aviation about when captains should refuse aircraft, even when dispatch is technically legal. The investigation didn't definitively resolve this debate, noting that Pearson's decision fell within legal bounds, while also observing that more conservative judgment might have prevented the situation. The lesson that emerged was that captains carry responsibility not just to follow procedures, but to evaluate whether those procedures provide adequate safety margins for the specific circumstances of each flight. For the aviation industry's approach to fuel management, Flight 143 provided a comprehensive examination of all the ways fuel calculations can go wrong and all the safeguards needed to prevent errors. The incident revealed that simply having fuel gauges isn't enough if they're not working, that dripstick measurements are only useful if properly converted, that conversion factors must be clearly understood and consistently applied, that multiple independent people must verify calculations using different methods, and that technology must be designed to make errors obvious rather than allowing them to hide in apparent agreement. Modern aircraft have fuel management systems with multiple redundant methods of measuring and calculating fuel quantity, making it virtually impossible for an aircraft to take off without adequate fuel, unless deliberately bypassed. The layers of protection now in place reflect lessons learned from Flight 143 and other fuel-related incidents, each layer addressing a specific failure mode, each contributing to overall system reliability. The human stories emerging from Flight 143 deserved preservation alongside the technical lessons. The passengers who experienced both engines failing and the subsequent emergency landing carried those memories forever, some with pride at having survived an extraordinary ordeal, others with anxiety about flying that required therapy to overcome. The flight attendants who managed the cabin during the crisis continued their careers, their professionalism during the emergency becoming part of their professional identity. The ground crew involved in the fuel miscalculation faced career impacts and personal difficulty, coming to terms with their role in creating the emergency, though their error occurred within a system that had failed to support them adequately. The race fans who witnessed the landing and helped evacuate passengers had stories they would tell for the rest of their lives. The afternoon their drag race was interrupted by a jetliner falling from the sky. Each of these individuals experienced Flight 143 through their own unique perspective, and collectively, their stories formed the human dimension of an incident often reduced to technical analysis and procedural lessons. As we reflect on Air Canada Flight 143, 4 decades after it occurred, we recognize it as an extraordinary moment in aviation history, one of those rare cases where everything went wrong, yet everything ultimately went right. The fuel miscalculation that left the aircraft with less than half the required fuel should never have happened, represented multiple failures of training, procedures, and judgment. The dual engine failure at 41,000 feet over remote wilderness created a seemingly impossible situation with no good options. Yet, through a combination of exceptional pilot skill, favorable circumstances, knowledge from unexpected sources, and remarkable luck. All 69 people aboard survived. Captain Pearson's gliding of a Boeing 767 for 65 miles to a dead-stick landing on an abandoned Air Force base turned drag strip stands as one of the most remarkable feats of airmanship in aviation history. First Officer Quintal's contribution in identifying a reachable runway provided the destination that made survival possible. The passengers and flight attendants maintained their composure through an utterly terrifying experience. The race fans cleared the runway and assisted with evacuation. Every element aligned to produce a successful outcome from what should have been catastrophic. The lessons learned continue to influence aviation safety practices today. Fuel management procedures incorporate multiple verification methods and clear assignment of responsibilities. Training programs emphasize basic flying skills and system understanding alongside automated operations. Organizational cultures encourage captains to exercise judgment beyond minimum regulatory compliance. Aircraft systems are designed to make errors obvious and provide adequate capability during emergencies. All of these improvements trace some lineage to incidents like Flight 143 that revealed vulnerabilities and prompted evolution of safety practices. The industry learned not by experiencing tragedy, but by having a very near miss provide warning that prompted changes before disaster occurred. This is the best kind of safety evolution, learning from close calls rather than catastrophes, though it requires an industry culture that treats close calls seriously rather than dismissing them as successful outcomes. The Gimli glider reminds us that aviation safety ultimately depends on human judgment and skill, backed by robust systems and procedures. Technology provides enormous benefits. Automation makes operations more efficient and reliable. Sophisticated systems monitor and manage aircraft functions far better than humans could manually. But when technology fails, when multiple systems go offline simultaneously, when the impossible scenario actually occurs, what remains is the fundamental relationship between pilot, aircraft, and the physical laws governing flight. Captain Pearson's ability to estimate glide performance without any manual guidance, to perform a forward slip in a heavy jet, to judge altitude and distance using only visual references, represented pure piloting skill unmediated by technology. That skill, combined with knowledge and experience from a lifetime of flying, saved 69 lives. The lesson is not that we should abandon technology, but rather that we must ensure pilots maintain the foundational skills that technology normally makes unnecessary. Because on that rare day when everything fails, those skills become the only thing standing between survival and disaster. The aircraft itself, Charlie Golf Alpha Uniform November, served honorably for another 31 years after its extraordinary landing, a testament to both the strength of Boeing's engineering and the quality of the repairs that returned it to service. It carried millions of passengers safely over those decades, each flight adding to a distinguished service record that included one of aviation's most remarkable emergencies. When it was finally retired and its nose section preserved in the National Museum, it transitioned from active service to educational role, teaching new generations about the events of July 23, 1983. Visitors standing before that nose section, seeing the actual structure that survived the emergency landing, can connect physically to history, can imagine the view from the cockpit as Captain Pearson guided the powerless aircraft toward Gimli, can appreciate the reality of what was accomplished. Good night, and safe travels.